Hello all Royal Rangers, my name is Commander Matthew Kenslow and I'm over here in the United States of America, and I've been a Royal Ranger for 20 years and year number 7 as a commander. Thank you so much for checking out this video. The purpose of this video is to go over a merit. In these videos I'm going to walk through every one of the requirements. Now it's important to note that while watching these videos it will not give you the merit. You have to show to your commander that you have watched and learned from these videos. What I recommend you doing is taking down notes for each requirement and then show them to your commander for approval. Some of the purposes of Royal Rangers is to build knowledge, wisdom, skills, and leadership attributes while learning about God's Word and conserving His resources practically. And most importantly, to have fun doing it. So I'm Commander Matthew Kenslow from the United States of America, and be blessed.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Photography Merit. Let's begin with requirement 1. List and identify at least 10 parts of an SLR camera. Now SLR stands for Single Lens Reflex Camera, and this is back in the day when they had film. So nowadays they have DSLR, Digital Single Lens Reflex Camera. And to do this merit I will focus more on the DSLR because that's what people use nowadays most often. But I will occasionally go back to the SLR to meet the requirements. So let's compare the difference between film and digital. A film camera exposes photographic film to light in order to take a picture. So that's when film is exposed to light. And a digital camera produces digital images that can be stored in a computer and displayed on a screen. So it has sensors, light sensors specifically, and we'll talk about that. But back in the days of film, this is what people got. This is what I grew up with ever since I was probably 0 years old. So this is what I remember is film. My mother and grandfather took pictures all the time and then went to get these developed. So these are the soon-to-be ancient roll of film. Okay, so I want to give just a very brief history of the camera. The camera obscura, Latin for dark room, circa 5th century BC. So as you see here, thousands of years ago, they had found that when light goes through a small hole, it can project an image onto a sheet or the rest of the wall, whatever you have. And this goes to the physics of light. Light bounces off objects and then it bounces off in all directions. Some of the rays of light from the object goes through a small opening and through the physics of light turns it upside down and reverses it and such. And this is kind of what I did a couple of years ago. As of the filming of this, it was 2 years ago this month when I was at the end of taking my my physics, electricity and magnetism course at Orange Coast College. And we learned about lenses and mirrors, concave versus convex, and light and such. And so I set up this little makeshift apparatus here with my lens from a broken magnifying glass and my Gaussian thermometer and sunscreen. And I took my flashlight and it bounced off the object, it went through the lens, and I actually projected it onto a sheet of paper. So I thought that was one of the most amazing things in the universe. So kind of the same principle applies. So this is the first known surviving photograph ever taken in the mid-1820s. The photographer set up his camera to face outside his window, and you could see the roof and nearby structures. Early photography called for special plates pre-processed with certain elements and chemical compounds, and additional compounds after exposure to keep the captured images from disappearing. It is believed that this photograph took 8 hours of sun exposure, whereas others said it took many days. And you could see that because there's light on this side as well as light on that side, which is impossible. So the sun was going all across the sky. I'm not sure which way is east and west in this picture. Nevertheless, it was quite a foundation for the science of photography. Later, in the mid 1800s, we have the daguerreotypes, and it was invented by a French person named Louis Daguerre, and he came up with the process. So here's an example of taking a daguerreotype, and usually when people had these pictures taken, they had to sit there and they couldn't move for seconds to minutes. And that's why a lot of people didn't smile back in the day a lot, because it's hard to hold a smile for that long of a time. Why? It's because of this here. This is the camera, and you prepare a light sensitive plate, and once it's prepared, then once it's exposed to light, then it's going to capture the image. So it's carefully covered, it's put inside this box here, the camera, and then the cover is lifted, and then the guy or the photographer takes out the lens cap, and that way light could go in, and the light sensitive plate is now exposed to the light. And now if this guy were to move or sneeze or anything, or if something were to happen, then it would be a blurry photo. And you can see that he has his pocket watch here, timing how long the exposure would last, and then he'll just put the lens cap back on, and then the plate would be developed, and then you have to fix it to the plate so it won't disappear, and then that's another process. But you could look all that up in a video online, but that's the basic process right there. So again, this is the daguerreotype. A lot of people in the 1800s, including notable people like presidents, were or had their pictures taken via the daguerreotype process. Here's the first self-portrait in 1839. Here's the first photograph of a U.S. president, 1843. Take a guess who this is. Yep, testing your knowledge of presidents. This is John Quincy Adams, president number 6 from 1825 to 1829. Okay, this is the oldest photograph in New York City, 1848. Here's the first aerial photo, and a guy's in a balloon over Boston. This is 1860. The first photograph of lightning in a tornado in the early 1880s. The first photos of the moon and sun in the 1840s. And the first photographs in color, which, you know, for like half my life I've always was fascinated about early colored photograph. You know, it makes it alive. And this was in 1861 and 1877 respectively. So it's just neat looking at a photograph from the 1800s that's in color. Okay, so Kodak by George Eastman. George Eastman founded Kodak, and this was manufactured film. His first camera went on sale in 1888, so that's when he started to have film instead of light sensitive plates. And here is the Brownie box, which went out in 1900. And this is where the word snapshot was coined. And basically, people like you and I could go and get this Brownie box and then take pictures. And it only takes a second, give or take, in lieu of like 30 seconds or a few minutes. And the reason why is because it uses lens. It uses a convex lens, and when light hits the lens, it refracts or bends, and then it gets focused on this point. That's where the film is. And the shutter, which we'll talk about later, just opens and closes when you snap the shot and take the snapshot. So this was quite a revolution in the early 1900s. Okay, so now we're going to actually list and identify at least 10 parts of the SLR camera. Now, I'm sure this is the DSLR, obviously, but I'm just going to use it as an example, so pretend it's an SLR. Okay, we have the pentaprism inside of here. So inside there's a series of mirrors, which we'll get to in a better photo later on, but briefly, the pentaprism flips an image from upside down to right side up and from backward to forward. 2 is the aperture ring, found on older cameras. So the aperture is the opening, usually at the back of the lens. It is used to limit the amount of light falling on the film. And we'll talk more about aperture later. Then you have the lens barrel, the filter threads, the lens or lens assembly. This focuses the light from the object being photographed onto the film. the focus ring to bring the subject to focus, and the camera body. This is the box that holds the film in position. So if this was an SLR camera, the film would be back here. Now it's just light sensors. And then the eyepiece. Okay, now let's look inside. So this is inside an SLR camera. So you have the path of light that goes through the lens and then through the aperture opening here, and then there's a mirror. The light from the subject bounces off the mirror, goes to this mirror, which bounces to this mirror, and then to the viewfinder. And this is what they had back in the day. And then behind the mirror was the shutter, and behind the shutter was the film. So light goes through the lens assembly and bounces off a series of mirrors so that you could see it. And then when you press the shutter button down, you take a picture. You usually see black at that second or at that instant. That's because the mirror is up and the light goes directly to the film. Also, the shutter is open, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay, now let's go on to requirement 2. Define the following terms. Camera body. The camera body is the box that holds the film in position. Lens. The most important part of the camera. It focuses the light from the object or objects being photographed onto the film. The total structure is called the lens assembly and consists of the lens barrel and the lens elements, actual glass lenses. Okay, not to get too complicated with physics, but this is how lenses work. You have concave or convex lens, or converging and diverging lenses. Light hits the object, goes in all different directions, but once it reaches the lens, it goes into another medium, glass. It slows down, it refracts, and then it produces an image. So it's pretty interesting. Okay, aperture. This is found on the back of the lens. It is a diaphragm or a set of thin metal blades used to limit the amount of light falling onto the film. Now we're going to be talking more about the aperture later in a future requirement, but just for a little preview, if you have a large aperture, that means you have a larger hole, but you only are in focus just a little bit of the photograph. But with a smaller aperture, you have more depth of field. You could see things in the foreground and the background, as well as the object that you're taking a picture of. And here's another example preview. It depends on what type of photograph you're trying to take and what your style is. If you want to focus in on a single object, like a sunflower and the nearby leaves, and not the background necessarily, then you want a larger aperture. But if you want more of a depth of field and see the things in the background, then you want a smaller aperture. Okay, now shutter. Most modern SLR cameras have a fabric shutter called a focal plane shutter or shutter curtain. Other types of shutters are sometimes found in the back of the lens, and in the cheapest cameras take the place of the aperture as well. So back in the day where we had film, more often than digital, you had a shutter curtain right here, and this opens and closes. You can see, just as an example of what it would look like, the shutter opens and closes. And you could control the speed that the shutter is open, which we'll talk about right now. So here's an example of a slow shutter speed. The shutter opens and closes at that speed, but here is a faster shutter speed and an even faster shutter speed. So it all depends. You could have a slow shutter speed, medium, or fast, and of course this is quantified like half a second, 1/250th of a second, which we'll get to later on. But what are the purposes, or more like applications, of shutter speed? If you're taking pictures of fast-moving objects or sports, then you would want a very fast shutter speed to literally freeze time. And then on this side, this was taken with the lower shutter speed. So light was exposed to the camera for a longer period of time, while this object was moving very quickly and causing a blurred effect. Okay, viewfinder. The part of the camera that the photographer looks through to aim the camera. It can be as simple as a hole through the camera body with only a thin sheet of plastic over each end of the hole, or it can be a complex viewfinder as found on the SLR. What's that called? The pentaprism. So this first part, simple as a hole through the camera body and such, that's basically where light goes straight through and you could see it directly. But the more complex viewfinder is where you have that pentaprism and light bounces all over the place until it reaches your eyes. Okay, light meter. Some cameras are set up for only general exposures and therefore have no controls over exposure, such as the controls of aperture and shutter settings. Better cameras have controls for how much light is allowed to hit the film. Knowing how much light you need is the job of the light meter. SLR camera is single lens reflex camera. Mirror. A mirror flips between two positions, down and up. So again, this is back when we had film. Well, we still have film, but kind of getting obsolete now. So we have the mirror back here. The light bounces off the mirror. It's angulated in such a way that it bounces up here to another mirror and through the pentaprism system so that it could reach your eyes. So when you snap the photo, the mirror comes up and the shutter opens and the light hits the film. When down, like in this top picture here, the mirror directs light from the lens onto the ground glass, which is this right here. This is a rectangular piece of frosted glass. When light from the lens hits this glass, it forms a visual image. Because of how lenses work, this image is upside down and backward. To see the image correctly, a special pentaprism flips the image horizontally and vertically for viewing. When it is up, it allows light to reach the shutter curtain. When the shutter curtain opens, the light hits the film. Okay, so here's a neat GIF that I found, and it's going to show everything in slow motion that we were just talking about. So here the mirror goes up, the light goes through, the shutter curtain is about to open, it just did. The light exposes onto the film, and the mirror comes down. Okay, requirement 3. Describe and demonstrate the steps in taking a successful photograph. Okay, so every good photo has a subject, of course. I mean, what are you taking a photo of? Let's say it's this tree. Okay, that's the subject. So a good photograph either tells a story or shows a single point. You need light in order to have a photograph. In fact, photo means light, like photosynthesis, for example. So you need a light source. It could be a sun, it could be a lamp, or your light in your house. But you need light, and of course you need the camera. So the light hits the object, called the subject of the photograph, and then it bounces back and into the lens, and then you take the picture. So here are the steps. Identify a subject, aim the camera and compose the picture in the viewfinder, set the exposure settings if necessary, and we'll talk about the 3 main variables later. Advance the film lever or dial if applicable. Focus the lens if necessary. Wait for the right moment and trip the shutter. In other words, press the shutter button down, take the photo. So here are the steps. Now you have to demonstrate this to your commander. Okay, requirement 4. Explain the concept of proper exposure of film relating film speed, aperture, and shutter speed. So these are the 3 variables. But first, let's do a little bit of critiquing. If you notice this picture right here, this picture is underexposed, it's too dark. This picture in the middle is overexposed, it's too light. And then this picture is the Goldilocks picture, it's just right. Here's another example of a waterfall. Now, here's a typical waterfall picture that you'll see. You'll see that the water is flowing. But this looks more like water splashing. It doesn't have that flow like a waterfall. This was taken with a quick shutter speed, so it's not as blurred as this shot right here. But people go for this shot when they take pictures of waterfalls. Okay, so you have 3 variables. ISO, or film speed, and yes, I heard that's pronounced ISO, not ISO. It's not an acronym. Aperture, and shutter speed. So when you see film speed, it's also ISO, and we'll talk about that. Now, again, you have 3 variables. and we're going to talk about each of them one by one. And you know, the scientist in me is wanting to add that when you have multiple variables, in order to find out what they do, you need to set all but one of them constant and then manipulate the other and see what happens. So we'll talk a bit about that. Okay, let's start with ISO, or film speed. This is how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So here's the camera sensor, and again, back in the day this would have been film. Again, ISO is how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So here is part of an image at a low ISO. So a low ISO number means that your camera sensor isn't going to be as sensitive to light versus a higher ISO number. So let's take a look at higher ISO numbers. Here's ISO 800, 1600, and 3200. So 3200 has the most sensitivity of light in this particular image. And you might think, well, that's great, we need a lot of light in our photograph. However, notice that the higher the ISO number is, the more grainy it is, the more noise there is. When outside in the daytime, it's best to keep the ISO low, but inside it is better to increase it. Okay, aperture. This is the size of the opening in the lens through which light passes. So these are thin metal blades that either increases or decreases the amount of light passing through, as you can see through this picture. Now these are called f-stop values right here, and these are actually fractions. And if you're good at math, you know that the higher the denominator gets, the smaller the quotient or the number will be. And therefore you can notice that the smaller the f-stop value, the wider the opening is. However, while learning a little bit about photography, I heard of a trick to help you understand the application of aperture and the f-stop values. So the greater the f-stop value, the greater depth of field you have, the more depth of field you have. So if you notice, you have a low f-stop value and you have a high f-stop value. So let's examine the guitar here. So at a low f-stop value, the opening is wide and the camera is focusing in on a certain part of the guitar up here. But as you increase the f-stop value, you could see more of the guitar. Like starting right here, you could see more of the background, and as you continue to increase the f-stop value, you could start to see more of the foreground. And here at f16, the diameter of the opening is so small that you could see the main part of the guitar that you were originally focusing at, plus the background and the foreground. So let's look at this image right over here. Here's f1.4, so that means you have a wide opening, so that means you're going to have a narrow depth of field range. So that's good if you want to focus in on a single subject like a bird, but not really the tree or the branch in the foreground. But if you want to have a little bit of the tree and a little bit of the branch in the foreground, perhaps a second or a third bird, then you want to increase the f-stop value so that you could have a more depth of field. And then for an even greater depth of field, you want to increase the f-stop value even more. However, let's notice that with a wide opening, more light could get through, but with a narrow opening, not a lot of light could get through. So let's take a look at this. So here, just like what I was alluding to before with science, if you want to see the effects of something with multiple variables, you keep all but one constant. Here we're going to manipulate the aperture, but we're going to keep the shutter speed and the ISO constant. Okay, so basically here's the aperture at the f-stop 1.8. This is a low f-stop value, so therefore the diameter of the opening is going to be large. That means a lot of light could get through, and you could definitely see that relative to 2.8 and 4 and 5.6, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So the shutter speed's the same, the ISO's the same, but again you could get a better depth of field, a greater depth of field with a greater f-stop value, but again with that narrow opening, not a lot of light could get through. If you look up here, you're not getting a lot of depth of field. It's a bit blurred in the background and the foreground relative to these down here. just to say as an observation. So when should you use different f-stop values? Well, if you want to take a picture of the stars, the Milky Way, and the moon, you want to have a lot of light. You may need to increase the ISO or the film speed some more, but you want to have a small f-stop value and therefore a wider opening, and therefore more light could get in, but also you need to take into account the shutter speed, which we'll talk about later on. And if you're taking a picture of a group of people, then you want to decrease it some more, and you'll have an extra depth of field to try to get everybody in and in focus, especially if there's people behind and in front of the subject that you're also trying to get as well. And then you want to narrow the opening more or increase the f-stop value more if you want more depth of field, like this distant volcano erupting here. And if you want to try to get everything, not just the house, but also the mountains and the clouds in the background, as well as the flowers in the foreground, meaning that you need the maximum depth of field, then you want to increase the f-stop even more to something like 11. Okay, shutter speed. This is the time of exposure. The amount of time light is exposed on film or on the camera sensor. This is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. So usually you could manipulate the shutter speed digitally, or in the old SLR cameras you could set it right here. Now these numbers aren't seconds. They aren't like 1 second, 2 second, 250 seconds, which is 4 minutes and 10 seconds. These are denominators right here. So in fractions, where are the denominators? The denominator is on the bottom, so like what I said before, the more you increase the denominator, the smaller the quotient or the value becomes. So basically, if you have a shutter speed at 2 right here, well, this is 1 over 2. It just saves a lot of space and numbers if you don't put like 1 over 2, for example. But this means that the shutter speed is a half a second. That means the shutter is open for a half a second. Let's advance right here at the 60. So this means 1 over 60. So that means the shutter is open 1/60th of a second. Here at 1/250th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, and even 1/4000th of a second, which is insanely fast. And then you have this B right here. Then that means that when you press down on the shutter button, meaning that you're taking a photo, the shutter is going to be open as long as your fingers on that shutter button. So you kind of control the amount of time of exposure. In certain DSLR cameras, you could also have long exposed photographs as well. You could set it to like 30 seconds, for example. And that's how you could get some of the neat shots with astronomy, which I will show you shortly. First, let's talk about the effects of shutter speed if we keep the other two constant. So at a higher shutter speed, think about it, the shutter is open very quick, so it doesn't have a lot of time for light to go inside, right? So at a higher shutter speed, it's a bit more dimmer than at a lower shutter speed, for example. But also keep this in mind, whenever you take a picture, you're going to shake the camera just a little bit. So if you have a low shutter speed, then it may be blurry just a little, and it may be blurry just a lot. So cameras have built-in timers like 2 seconds or 10 seconds, and you could set the camera on something like a tripod, press the shutter button, and then it will take the picture like 10 seconds later, absolutely still. So here's what I was getting at earlier. This picture of the stars in the Milky Way galaxy was taken with a long shutter speed. It's a long exposed photograph right here, and that allows time for all these pinpoints of light to reach through to the sensor of the camera. Also, there's more light that came in. Remember the amount of time light is exposed on film or on the camera sensor. So you could see that it is a bit bright. You could see a lot of the mountains and the trees and such, and the lake as well. So that's how you take such a marvelous photograph, if you ask me. Here's some fun things that you could do with having long exposure photographs. You could get these light trails. So here cars are zooming by in this photo and that photo, and here the planes are taking off and landing and such. and you don't really see any people or any cars because these are long exposed photographs. The other cars are still, the lamppost and the house and the tree and such, and the walls and the runways are visible and clear because they were absolutely still. Other subjects like people and bicyclists and cars and airplanes and such cannot be picked up because they weren't there long enough for the camera to expose them in the photograph. And therefore I have this neat picture right here. I believe this was also taken by Louis Daguerre in the 1830s, I believe. But this is the first photograph of a human being, or at least the earliest known photograph of a human being. You see, you can't see like anybody else or anything because they're walking by during the exposure. Again, this was Louis Daguerre before George Eastman and film, and so he had light sensitive plates that were exposed for a very long time. But this individual was having his shoes polished, according to what when I researched this photo, and so he had to stay there for a long time, enough to be in the photograph. Here's another neat thing that you could do with a slower shutter speed. You can make designs, words, messages, and such. And so here's a summary of what I've just talked about. So here it talks about aperture. So the greater the f-stop value, the greater depth of field you have. Here's shutter speed, and this is good for sports. Otherwise it'd be blurry. And then ISO, which is a measure of how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. But again, the higher the ISO value, the more grainy it is. Okay, requirement 5 is take at least 24 photographs. Have the roll of film, if you're using film, developed, or obtain a printed copy of the digital images. Critique your results. Use any 4 of the following types. Okay, so here are 8 types, and I'm going to go through them one by one. Snapshot. The most common type of photo is referred to as a snapshot. It is taken casually and without much thought for composition. B. Portrait. This is a photograph of a person, group of people, or even an animal or pet. Careful composition and lighting are used to create a picture that will capture the personality of the subject, usually in a flattering or complimentary way. So here's a portrait of Albert Einstein. Still life. This is a photograph of a small scene, usually indoors, or various objects arranged in a visually pleasing way. Landscape. Typically thought of as a nature photo, a photograph of a mountain range, lake, forest, beach, farm, etc. Cityscape. This is an urban version of a landscape, a block of high-rise buildings, skyline of a city, street scene, traffic photos, etc. Architectural photography is the photographing of buildings for their own merit. Here's a picture that I took of downtown Los Angeles on July 30th, 2017. Here's an example of a skyline. When we got closer, I just looked up, pointed my camera, and took this shot. And I did not take this shot, but I added it because I wanted to show the world's tallest building here in Dubai, over 2,700 feet. Skyscape. These include pictures of interesting cloud formations, storms, sunsets, or even lightning and tornadoes. If you're interested, I have a lot of naturescape videos on YouTube, and I'll put a card up here if you're interested in that. But I just got an interest in taking pictures of various things, including clouds and other naturescapes, among other things. Documentary. This covers a large variety of subjects and styles. A documentary photograph is really any picture whose aim is to capture the reality of a subject. Unlike the portrait or the various scapes, a documentary photograph is not intended to flatter or, conversely, demean the subject. Rather, a documentary photograph is intended to capture the true nature or essence of the subject. People at work or play, news events, accidents, parties, or even rangers' meetings or events are suitable subjects of documentary photographs. Creative photography. This is really a frame of mind more than a style of photograph. Double exposures, exaggerated perspective, unusual framing or lighting, etc., and are forms of creativity in photography. Humorous photographs are a form of creative photography designed to entertain the viewer with an amusing or ironic approach. So again, take 24 photographs using at least 4 of the 8 following types. Okay, requirement 6. Learn and demonstrate the following. A. Take a digital photo, unless already done for requirement 5. B. Download a digital photo into a computer. If you're using a digital camera, it may have came with USB, micro USB, an SD card, or micro SD card, and then you could just insert that into the computer. And C. Insert the photo into a document and print it and send it by email to a friend. Okay, so big congratulations, you got a great start on the photography merit. The next step is to show your commander the notes, what you've studied, the photographs and such. Once again, good job and keep up the great work.